And if you look at poverty statistics from 1976 to 2010, Hispanics, blacks, and whites. Now these are raw numbers, these are not percentages. This one we're actually looking at the raw number in millions of white poor children, black poor children, and Hispanic poor children. Now of course, whites make up a very large percentage of our population. Somewhere in the vicinity of 70%, give or take. So you would think even with lower poverty, even with lower poverty rates for kids, simply the sheer size of the white population guarantees a lot of poor white kids. Now, African Americans, in spite of having a much smaller portion of the population, roughly 12%, a little over, African Americans have basically caught up in the last few years with whites in terms of the sheer number of poor black kids compared to poor white kids. But then look at what has happened to Hispanics. Hispanic child poverty numbers, not rates, but numbers, have skyrocketed during the Great Recession. And now, even though Hispanics make up less than 14% of the U.S. population, making them the largest single ethnic racial minority group in America, but still clearly a minority population in terms of the larger population. By 2010, there were significantly more poor Hispanic kids than either poor white kids or poor black kids. And a lot of that occurred very, very quickly. So a lot of those disturbing numbers we looked at in terms of child poverty rates for Hispanics really happened very quickly. Now, let's pause for a minute and look a little bit about wealth differences and how changes in household wealth have changed across different racial and ethnic groups. Here we're going to focus on whites, blacks, and Hispanics. Before we get into that, let me point out that if you see large income differences between these various groups, well then the differences in net worth or wealth tend to be much larger. By the way, that's true in general. But it's also true, even truer if you will, when you look at breaking the data down by racial and ethnic groups. Now, this presentation is going to focus mostly on what's happened in the very recent past from 2005 to 2009, looking at the percentage change in median net worth of households. For whites, there was a decline. The Great Recession hit everyone, and there was a 16% decrease according to this Pew Research Center study. For Hispanics, it was much larger, a 66% decline. And finally, for blacks, it was a 53% decline. And here you can look at median wealth ratios, the ratio of white wealth to black wealth. How many multiple times could the typical white family, or pardon me, how much wealth relative to a typical black family does a typical white family have? Well, back in 1984 it was 12 to 1. 1988, 10 to 1. It stayed around 10 to 1 throughout much of the 1990s, and then it actually declined. African Americans were catching up in the mid-90s. It was 7 to 1. Still a huge disparity. Whites having $7 in wealth compared to blacks, at least on average. But at least that number was way down. By 2004, it had risen to 11 to 1. And it has shot way up by the Great Recession, 2009, to 19 to 1. What about Hispanics, comparing white wealth to Hispanics? Well, once again, we see a very similar pattern. Generally speaking, Hispanics throughout most of this period, in fact throughout the entire period, compared slightly more favorably to whites than blacks did. But even so, whites had many times the net worth or wealth shown here compared to your typical Hispanic household or family. 1984, 8 to 1. 1988, 8 to 1, and so forth and so on. All the way through this period, whites continue to have non-Hispanic whites tend to have a lot more wealth than Hispanics. And then once again in 2009, that ratio shoots way up as whites pull ahead farther and farther in front of Hispanics. Now, I have to be really careful with this data because it is tricky and it could very well be misleading. So I'm going to read this quick panel here to kind of fill in a gap or two. In an alternative approach, I should say, measuring the wealth gap trend, this report, the one we just talked about, measures the changing wealth gaps between whites, Hispanics, and blacks using ratios. That actually changes the results or frames them in a certain way. An alternative approach would be to measure changes in absolute levels rather than ratios, literally to count the dollars difference in the wealth of some families versus others, depending on their race or ethnicity. By that yardstick, the median wealth gaps between these groups actually decreased from 2005 to 2009. You got that? In other words, it does matter how you measure and conceptualize these figures when you're making comparisons. Making comparisons in absolute dollars actually shows something of a decline in the wealth between whites and blacks or whites and Hispanic. For example, in 2005, the median wealth of white households was a little over $116,000, more than the median wealth of Hispanic households. So I have to be careful here. That's more than, that's in addition to. Over $100,000 richer than the typical Hispanic household. By 2009, the difference had shrunk to $106,800. So it had shrunk almost $10,000. The same is true for black-white differences in median wealth. This means that while households experienced a greater absolute drop in their wealth, whites did, I should say. Whites actually, if you're measuring in dollars, because they started out with more wealth, they had bigger dollar losses during the Great Recession. However, and again, they're pointing out the wealth base for whites so much larger to start out with compared to blacks and Hispanics. Then when you look at proportional decreases in whites, it was actually less. So again, sometimes it makes a difference whether you're comparing ratios or absolute numbers. You got to be a little careful. But clearly, the analysis still clearly shows one thing, which is that, well, actually two things. First of all, that all of these groups suffered badly during the Great Recession, but it also shows continuing, persistent, large differences between blacks and whites, between Hispanics and whites, with the minority groups in each case having significantly less wealth and less net worth. Now, here we're looking at, we kind of got this one out of order, but I'm going to proceed. We're far enough along, I'm not going to backtrack. Here we're looking at children under the age of 18 broken down by family status and nativity of children. This is one that I should have put up when we were talking about Hispanics and child poverty. Basically, without going through all the details here. If you look at native-born parents and children, child poverty rates tend to be very low, or at least relatively low compared to other groups. On the other hand, if you're looking at foreign-born children and parents, kids who've been brought by foreign immigrants into the United States who were born in another country, those kinds of households have much higher rates of poverty back in 2007, and also more households that are either just a little above poverty too. That's what this is showing here. So you have a lot of near poverty and a lot of true poverty for foreign-born children and parents. And that's clear when you compare it to the kids who are born in the United States and their parents are born in the United States. So what I'm getting at is your status, whether you're born out of the country or inside the country, appears to affect child poverty rates. And both the nativity of the child and the parent appear to influence the risks that kids have being in poverty. Now let's shift our conversation here quickly to talk about one more socioeconomic difference across racial and ethnic groups. In this case, we're going to talk very quickly about education. Bachelor's degrees granted in 2009, 2010, broken down by race and ethnicity. Share of population, Asians make up 4%, but accounted for 7% of all degrees. And by the way, there's also a gender gap you could look at if you wanted to look at these numbers. I'm not going to focus on that right now. Whites made up 60% according to this figure from the Department of Education. That's a very narrow definition of whites, by the way. At any rate, they're saying they make up 60%, but they made up 71% of all degrees earned. So both whites and Asians were overrepresented in terms of education. Native Americans or American Indians, 1% of the population, 1% of the degrees, just exactly what you would expect from the proportion of the population, neither underrepresented or overrepresented. African Americans making up 15%, that figure's a little higher than the one you normally see. Nevertheless, however you count it, they were underrepresented, 15% of the population, 10% of degrees rewarded. And finally, Hispanics, 18% of the population, again, somewhat larger than you typically see in these kinds of studies. But they're suggesting 18% of the population and 9% of the degrees rewarded, even more heavily underrepresented in terms of college degrees. Now, there is good news here when you look at minority status and education across many groups, whites, non-whites, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, and so forth. You're seeing a trend where more and more kids are going to college, more and more kids are graduating from college. Here we're looking at the share of 18 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled in college, broken down by race and ethnicity as of 2010. And you can see, again, we're looking at percentages or rates here. So Asians are heavily overrepresented, or at least they're represented in the highest percentages from their population. Whites as well, then blacks and Hispanics. But even with the lowest group, Hispanics, you're still talking about in the ballpark of a third of 18 to 24-year-old Hispanics are currently enrolled in school. At the same time, minority students are a growing percentage of all undergraduates. Back in 1988, about 22% of those enrolled in school as undergraduates were minority members. By 1998, 10 years later, it had grown from 22% to 30%. And by 2008, it had grown further to 37%. And here's probably the best news when it comes to education. We're seeing gains in educational attainment across racial or ethnic groups. Here you're looking at data from 1980 to the year 2010, looking at the percent of each of these racial or ethnic groups percent 25 years and older who completed high school. I have to be careful here. So high school graduation rates are rising for virtually every group. In fact, they are rising for every group. And here we're looking at bachelor's degrees for those 25 and older from 1980 to 2010. And you see upward trends for Hispanics, for blacks, for whites, for Asians. Yes, it's true that Asians graduate college at much higher rates than whites, who in turn graduate at higher rates than blacks or Hispanics. But the good news is that it's increasing across groups. So, as we begin to wind down very quickly, I'll simply point out that there are many ways in which America is an unequal country in which wealth, income, education, and other valued social resources are distributed unequally. And frankly, race and ethnicity is one of the important dimensions of inequality in the United States. Thank you very much.